made you choose Oregon as a place to start your vineyard?
Well, I was actually looking in California before I chose Oregon, and the more I looked in California, the more Oregon made sense to me, because California wasn't making any sense. I was looking for cool areas to grow varieties like Riesling and Pinot Noir, and the places down there at the time that I could also support a family and support myself were either in the Santa Cruz Mountains, which is like a big pile of rocks, and not much good ground there, and then up where in the Anderson Valley, which is a cool place in California, showed promise, but I would have had to fix TVs in my spare time to make a living. So about this time, I had gotten a job offer from Tektronix in Beaverton, and so I came up to interview for that job in the fall of '67. By that time, I pretty much had come to the conclusion that I really needed to take a hard look at Oregon. And that all happened because I was taking classes in winemaking in 1967 at Davis, and was asking about, where are they growing Pinot Noir outside of California, and I heard the professor at the time, Dr. Singleton, said, well, I had a couple guys come through here last year. One was Chuck Corey and one was Dave Lett, and they're up there in Oregon somewhere, so I got their addresses from Dr. Singleton, and then, but he said, there's a guy right here in the room, that in the back of the class, and sure enough, there's this fellow named Richard Summers, who was the first one to plant vinifera after Prohibition in Oregon in the Roseburg area in 1961. And he was very excited that I showed interest in Oregon, and he couldn't wait to give me but a couple bottles of wine. And I was living in Walnut Creek at the time and wasn't too far from Davis. And when the classes were over, I rushed back to Walnut Creek. I couldn't wait to open these bottles of wine. And I have to tell you, he was a really, everyone was a shoestring operation back then, but I think even more so than any others, because he used freshly emptied whiskey barrels to put the wine in, and I don't even think he bothered rinsing them out, because he wanted to get little added, hit from the whiskey that was remaining in the barrels, So not only did the wine, the wine tasted like a lot of whiskey, but behind all that, there was some nice fruit character there. So that's when I decided to take the interview with Tektronix in 1967. It was right World Series time, and that's when the grapes were getting ripe in Southern Oregon. So I drove up, did the interview. Dave Lett was out selling books at the time. Chuck Corey was at his house, and we stayed up one morning till like 4 in the morning, and he lived in a house that was boarded off because it was an old farmhouse, couldn't heat it, and it was like 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. You hear the rats scurrying around in the walls, and but we had a great time. And the next morning I left and I went down to see Richard Summers at Hillcrest Vineyard outside of Roseburg. Picked some grapes, and I smuggled about 600 pounds of grapes into California in the back of the car, and I took it to the house and made some small lots of wine, and they were, I thought, tremendous at the time. So I accepted the job with Tektronix and moved the family up in February 1968, and by the end of '68 we found the first 48-acre piece of ground, which is north of here on Dopp Road, and I bought the property from Mrs. Dopp. It was the first time there was ever a transaction in the family where the property was homesteaded. So it was the first time anyone sold any. I bought like half of what she had. First thing I wanted to do was, I figured, I have to drill a well, get some water, and that should be easy in Oregon with all the rainfall. And I didn't realize that there's a thing called an aquifer, and that the aquifers there weren't very good, and I got a dry hole basically. So we ended up finding an old logger's cabin that was not inhabited, and the fellow that owned the cabin lived in Oakland, California, where I grew up, and he went to the same high school I went to, but in a different year, so I didn't know him. And he wanted to get insurance on this cabin, and they wouldn't give him insurance because no one was living there. So we made a deal. If I fixed up the cabin, I could live there free of charge, and it was supposed to be a short stay. Well, that turned out to be 3 years. And during that time, Dave Adelsheim came by, and other people came by and wanted to know what all these crazy, what are these guys doing here planting grapes? And what are you doing? Why are you planting grapes here? And so it's place to, if you want to make great Pinot Noir, you have to go to a climate that matches its requirements. Can't force it. You can't force it into something, a mold that it won't take.
I understand that you saw a correlation between Oregon strawberries and grapes.
Well, at Pinot Camp time, the grapes aren't ripe in June, but the strawberries are. So what I do is the comparison is that if you taste the strawberry from Oregon, it's about flavor, flavor, flavor. They're not beautiful, same shaped things, but they're very intense flavored fruit, and that's what happens when you grow fruit in a northern climate. The amount of extracts that come from the fruit goes up. So it's the same thing that happens with the grapes. So that's how I kind of show people that time of year what we're experiencing here, that we have a not tremendously long, but a nice long maturation period that starts when it's starting to cool off, and we maintain the natural acidity in the fruit without losing those flavors, and that gives us the opportunity to really make wonderful wines.
Why Pinot Noir?
Well, it's the holy grail of winemaking. I mean, it's such a wonderful. It's I don't know how to explain it. It's the best grape to work with because it makes I think the best wine possible. It also can make the worst wine possible, and we need to have that climate that we have here. And then when we do all the things that everyone else does, measure the grape with instrumentation, but it's that final flavor that we taste in the vineyard that tells us when to harvest. And sometimes I after 72 was my first vintage, I still can't tell you today I can tell you what makes a good Pinot Noir, but I'm not sure if I can tell you what makes one that is like out in outer space.
I heard when y'all started growing Pinot Noir in late 60s, that you were making a wine that nobody wanted. Do you feel like you introduced Pinot Noir?
Well, the problem with Pinot Noir is that it back then, and even to a certain extent now, it's a grape variety that makes so many different stylistic wines, and it reflects where it's grown. And when it's grown in the wrong place, it doesn't taste very good. And so to really, people, wine drinkers, general consumers really, probably unless they were going to spend $50 for a good bottle of Burgundy, don't know what Pinot Noir is supposed to taste like in the first place. So it has an identity problem, or had an identity problem. Now I think is not. I mean, people are making Pinot Noir much better now than they did, back in the early '60s, or even late '60s. So, and now it's a category that people I think have some more of a comfort zone with, because they know that it can make really wonderful wine.
So do people still have a problem knowing what it's supposed to taste like?
I think they're getting better at it. I mean, Oregon Pinot Noirs, I think now you can taste them blind and it's probably from Oregon. I don't think we're to the point where you can say it came from this piece of ground or that piece of ground, but we can also identify, I think after these years, Oregon vintages. Everyone's doing pretty much the same way now. We're growing the grapes better than we used to. We're making the wine better, so we're getting more consistent.
Well, what are what's the evolution of your business? I mean, you're saying you're doing it better. What do you mean?
Well, it's best to look what we do now than what we didn't do. I think in the growing of the grapes, we've really progressed a lot. We use tighter spacings in the vineyard. Then those of us who were educated about grape growing at Davis, you can plant grapes at 8 feet between them and 12 feet in the rows, and it doesn't make any difference. Well, it does. And so now we're planting about half that spacing and producing better fruit. We're doing things like removing secondary buds. That's going on right as we speak. Then we're doing cluster removal, shoot removal, hedging, leaf removal. These are things that in the early days we didn't do. We were very happy to get what we got. So we're improving. I think we're improving the fruit that's coming out of the vineyard, so that's much more consistent.
I noticed that you alternate your rows with clover. What's that about?
Well, there's several things going on in the vineyard right now. As there are more and more vineyards in the area, we've now experiencing some increase in mite population, and the mites suck the sap out of the leaves, right, and taking energy from the plant. And rather than spray insecticides for the mites, we're controlling the mites with predator mites and making an environment for the predator mites to live. And then the clover aspect of it is we want to increase the exchange capacity of the soil by increasing the humus content by then rototilling or disking into the clover back in the ground, which makes a natural fertilizer. Trying to do as many things as we can with what's called low impact viticulture and enology. It's I think it started in Switzerland a number of years ago, and many Oregon vineyard wineries are adapting that viewpoint and those practices.
Do you see a trend around the country?
I think it's happening. You see more organic wines now than you used to. This is not exactly organic, but it's getting close. And I think the consumer is going in that direction. You can certainly see it with the grocery stores like Whole Foods and Nature's.
Can you tell me about clones with Pinot Noir?
Clones of Pinot Noir. The grape varieties that go into winemaking are the results of man going out in the wild and finding something that had grapes on it and saying, let's grow this. And over the centuries, they have found varieties that naturally occurred. So they're like about 500, because of this selection process going on for so many years, about 500 known grape varieties that are used to make wine. Probably 25 or so that you and I would probably be recognized. And because Pinot Noir has a propensity to have genetic mutations, you'll find that it's happening more with Pinot Noir than other varieties. And we've actually, and what we're talking about here is clones. It's not cloning. It's clones are. I like to think of it as you have a family with maybe 10 kids in it, and they're all different. And you've got some bad ones and some good ones, and some behave a lot better than the others. And so we're always looking for the ones that behave the best for us in terms of winemaking and grape growing. And it takes and once you found a clone, you really don't know until you've tested a while that it's going to be genetically stable. We have one clone of our own vineyard that we've been propagating now for about 3 or 4 years. It shows a lot of promise, but last year it did some strange things in the vineyard, so we're not sure if it's going to be stable or not. The clone thing starts out because in California, the clonal selection programs down there are for clones that like hotter weather, and it's particularly true with Chardonnay in California. The clones that they use like the much higher heat accumulation, and we found it didn't do very well in Oregon. So we started bringing in clones from France in 1978, and those clones made much better wine because they came from a cooler area. So the whole idea is to bring in. It started in 1974. So we were sensitive. The first thing we were sensitive to when we got here in the 60s was what varieties to plant, what's going to grow. I had 23 varieties in 4 acres to begin with. And many of those varieties we passed over. They didn't mature. There was some problem. They didn't do well here. And then we had Oregon State University do a phenological study, which is taking a group of varieties and planting in different locations in the state to see how they would do, and then relating their ripening times so that you could say, well, you were suitable for growing this variety, but not that variety, like Willamette Valley versus the Rogue Valley would be different varieties that you would choose. Then we said the next thing that we realized is that, well, that maybe the clones that we're working with, since most of them came from California, maybe weren't the best clones that we should be using in Oregon. So we started to bring in clones in 1978 from France, and that went from 78 to 88 basically. And a lot, what we call the Dijon clones, all came from the efforts here in Oregon, and they came to Oregon before they came to California, and now they're being disseminated all over the United States.
Is grafting a big issue in your?
Well, grafting is used to establish vineyards so that phylloxera won't kill them. Phylloxera being an insect that lives below the ground and chews on the roots and kills the roots of vinifera. It doesn't kill the roots of Native American varieties. So when phylloxera came in the 1870s, the solution, the preferred solution, was to graft the vine that you wanted to onto a rootstock. Then in 1990, we confirmed the existence of phylloxera here in the Dundee Hills. So it's been we've been replanting the vineyards to resistant rootstock. But if you look at this as a silver lining in a black cloud, there's all the rootstock selection. We can modify the growth cycle. The vegetative cycle of the plant is modified by what rootstock you choose. So we can hasten the ripening of the fruit, or delay it a little bit, however we choose. So it's nice to have that variable in our hands.
You've seen the winemaking industry in Oregon pretty much from the beginning. Can you speak to the innovations and the changes that you've seen throughout the years?
Well, I think in the winemaking, first of all, I think winemaking worldwide is improved tremendously. Advent of stainless steel, the technology in the winemaking, the choosing of different yeast strains, the temperature controlling of the fermentations, that's something that's improved worldwide. Specific to Oregon is what we're doing with Pinot Noir. Is we're looking at the old traditional ways of how they make wine in Burgundy, and pretty much adapting those traditional ways to modern technology, so that we can get the best of both worlds, so to speak. And we know so we can temperature control the fermentations in stainless steel. We do minimal handling of the fruit, so we avoid bruising the fruit. We don't even use a crusher anymore at our winery. We just de-stem the fruit. We want to keep the berries intact as much as possible.
Do you do that with all of your varieties, or just Pinot Noir?
Well, for Pinot Noir, we do that. For our white varieties like Pinot Gris, we'll use whole. We don't even take the berries off the cluster. We'll press the clusters whole, and it's not as efficient in terms of equipment usage, but it gives a much better quality juice and therefore a better quality of wine.
Your background in electrical engineering, has it had any influence on your
Keeps
wine?
me up all night, especially during harvest. I mean, because something goes wrong, unfortunately I know how to fix it. I mean, I fixed Harry's press one day. It's. Well, the thing is about engineering is when you have one field, you generally know other fields because you're exposed to all the other fields. So once you know electrical engineering, you know a little civil, little mechanical, and so it's for me it's been a great mix of what I was trained in plus what my aspiration was. I wanted to be a photographer when I was later. Not exactly when I was growing up. When I was a little kid, I wanted to be an engineer driving a big train. That was the thing. And then later on, I wanted to be a photographer. And so I studied with Ansel Adams for a couple of weeks in 1963 and sold landscape photography that I did and made $600 one year. And I think this wasn't going to make the grade. So But I still love photography, and to me, photography and winemaking have a lot in common.
You are quite an accomplished artist, and can you speak a little bit more about how your art does influence your winemaking?
Well, Ansel Adams always had this saying that when you're making a negative and you're making the print, is the print is the interpretation of the negative. Sort of like a musical score. That the score is what the composer wrote, but the performance is the actual conductor at that point in time. Well, as in the wine thing, the negative is all this fruit out there that's coming to us in that particular year, and then the performance if the winemaker is the conductor, then it's how stylistically is he handling that fruit and interpreting the fruit that year and making that wine. So I think it's a strong analogy.
Is winemaking fun?
Is it fun? Well, yeah, it is. I mean, I have to tell you, every now and then I like to play a little golf. So I was playing golf not too long ago with a fellow who was retired from General Motors, and he's probably about 10 years younger than I was. And I said, Larry, how did you get retired so early? And he said, well, they have a great retirement program there. And I said, well, I'm still looking to get retired. And he looked at me for a while and he said, Dick, I've never met a retired winemaker. I mean, it's something you just keep doing. It's because it is so fun. I don't think of it as work at all.
What is the ideal vineyard for you? Do you have a criteria? Have you found it yet? Are you still looking?
The ideal vineyard changes from year to year. If we have a cool climate, then I like a really nice southern exposed site because it's going to get maximum amount of energy input from the sun during the ripening period. If it's a hot year like the last couple of years we've had, I really like the east slopes because they don't have as much heat accumulation, but they have a longer maturation period and the acidity holds up better. So it's not the same every year.
At the beginning of the year, you can sort of see how the weather pattern is going, how the weather trends. Does that make you change your planting in mid-year, or does it affect future years?
If you're worried about the weather in Oregon and you're a winemaker, ulcers would come very quickly. So I remember when I was looking for land in 1968, and I was banging on doors because people didn't know what you wanted in terms of vineyards. So I was looking for a place on Calkins Lane. I remember finding a farmer standing out by his barn, and I asked him about the weather, and he said something to me that I never have forgotten. It was like he said, "Hey, Sonny, that in Oregon you get the same amount of heat and the same amount of cold and the same amount of wet and the same amount of dry. You just don't know when you're going to get them." So that's pretty much true. Although in the last, since 1998 now, we've had a series of really great years, and I wonder if it's some part of a longer-term cycle. In the 1700s, grapes were grown almost near Berlin in Germany, and the weather was cooling, and they just the vineyards recessed to the south, and now we're seeing vineyards going more north again. I'm just wondering if we're in some 500-year cycle or something like that. We just don't recognize it.
How do you keep Pinot Noir, or how do you make it affordable?
Growing our own grapes it helps a lot, and we're our ground. We haven't purchased any ground since 1983, so we don't have a lot. Our capital costs are not nearly as much as they would be if we started today. And we have crop levels for our vintage wine that approach 3.5 tons the acre, 3.6, and it depends on the year. We also, in sites that are vigorous, use a training system that's actually invented by Scott Henry in Southern Oregon. It now bears his name, the Scott Henry training system, where you actually, if you have enough vigor, you can divide the canopy and increase the yield per acre because you're increasing the amount of leaf area also. Because the leaf area is what's manufacturing the sugars and the flavors for the grapes. So what we're trying to do is, plus we also make a lot of wine. I mean, we make in the vintage category we're up to 28,000 cases now. So we have some economy of scale going on.
But you think people can afford to drink it every day?
Hopefully, I hope they do.
Can I ask a question as a follow-on to that? How about talking about terroir versus climate, and then spin off of terroir and talk about single vineyard wines versus blended wines?
Are you asking the questions? So Harry's asking this question, so I'm going to. Terroir in Oregon is in its infancy, I think. Here in Oregon, we have either basaltic soils, which evolved from 23 different lava flows over the centuries that covered Oregon, and those are the younger soils. They're the majority. We're sitting on top of them right now. The older soils, the sea bottom soils, are the ones that are underneath, and they're exposed, and those are the two soils that are used primarily for growing grapes, because they constitute the hillside soils, and we haven't even talked about that. And here in Oregon, all the best vineyards are on hillsides because of the drainage of the water. We have about over 40 inches of rain, so we have to handle the drainage aspect, and also the air drainage. There was a frost about 10 days ago, and some vines in the valley floor were affected because the cold air settled on them. But there was no problem here in the hills because the cold air is draining down. So that's why you plant on hillsides. Then, we have these different soils. We have the basaltic soils and the old sea bottom soils. And whereas and there is basically no limestone in Oregon. So I don't prescribe to the notion that you have to have limestone to make great Pinot Noir, because there are a lot of great Pinot Noirs being produced in Oregon without limestone. I can taste the difference between grapes coming off of the basaltic soils and the shaly sea bottom soils. But I don't know if I could tell you anything beyond that. I couldn't say, well, this grape came from Harry's particular vineyard, and this one from, Dick Shea's particular vineyard, because there's so many other elements involved in terroir. It's not only the soil; it's the exposure, the wind speed, the number of days with wind, cloudy days versus the elevation changes. Terroir is the whole thing wrapped together. And one thing that Adelsheim and I did years ago was we made an experiment with training systems, and I can influence the way a grape tastes, the way I train the vineyard, probably more so than the soil they're growing on. Because if you shade the fruit in a canopy that shades the fruit, the composition of the fruit is going to be really different, as opposed to a canopy that emphasizes vertical shoots, which what we do. The best vineyards here have vertical shoot positioning, because we have to optimize the amount of sunlight that we're gathering. The aspect of terroir is, I think, not fully understood by a lot of people. It's not just the soil; it's the total environment that the grape's in, which includes the wind speed, direction, slope, elevation, cloudy days, sunny days, rainfall, all the elements that are there. And it's impossible, I think, to have a young vine, for example, express terroir because its roots haven't gone down yet to mine. If you think of a root system of a plant, it's down there mining the soil and picking up micronutrients. It takes a while for those roots to get down there. So young vines won't, I think it takes at least 6 or 7 years old before you start seeing some of that happening. The other thing I think that's really not understood about old vines versus young vines, in a reasonably even year where we don't have a lot of stress, because what happens in Oregon, we're very wet in the spring. The soils are laden with water, but by the time August rolls around, they're really dry. So we go from a situation of too much moisture to not enough moisture. Well, the older vines now have sunk their roots down, and they have sustenance. They're going. The young ones are like wilting. They're drooping. They want to get out of this situation. So, and what happens then is that the older vines see these tough times through much easier. They roll with the punches where the young vines don't. So that I think makes a big difference to the final results, particularly with Pinot Noir, because I've actually seen the fruit shrivel and give water back to the leaves in young vines just to satisfy the transpiration requirements.
Single vineyard wines versus blended wines. This is a critical point for, I think, for modern discussions.
Right. Our vintage wines are wines that are blended from many vineyards from year to year from many different lots for consistency. That's one group of wines. Then as we identify vineyards, particularly these vineyards that are older, that have rolled with the punches and have some maybe terroir aspect to them, we then will call those single vineyard wines. We only do that if we think that wine is better than a blended wine. And it only happens in years of really excellent vintage that we do a single vineyard wine. I think, to me, the most exciting thing about making Pinot Noir is we make several different levels. We start at a vintage Pinot, then we do a blended reserve, and then we do some single vineyard wines. The blended reserves are very challenging because we found in 1976 that taking grapes from grown on Willow-Kinsey soil were light and aromatic, blending them with grapes grown on basaltic soils, which were darker and more extracted and richer in the mid-palate. Putting those two together made a wine that was much better than either one by themselves. So blending is really an important tool, particularly because of the number of clones that back then, and it's getting better now, we only had a couple clones to work with. In Burgundy, there's many clones in the same vineyard, so you can get tremendous complexity out of one vineyard, where in Oregon we had to get complexity by going to different vineyards with simpler clones. It's replicating the same thing done in a different way.
Except for possibly grape propagation and because you had nursery operations in early years and how grapes are propagated. Maybe it's just an extension of the clonal question. But.
Well, when we first came to Oregon in '68, you couldn't. Real estate people didn't know what vineyard ground was. I mean, they'd call us up and ask, "Is this a good piece of vineyard ground?" There were no nurseries here to buy plants from. We came with the knowledge of what we needed to plant, but we had to import all the plant material, and at that time it came from California. We want to always be sure we're planting things that have no virus disease in them, because that tends to hinder the ripening process. So while a vineyard that has great red leaves on it might make a great photograph, that's probably a virus that you're photographing. So we found ourselves establishing our own nursery because we had to bring in plant material and propagate it. And when in the early 70s, material was released in very limited quantities of heat-treated material, which had the heat treatment takes the virus out of it immobilizes the virus, and these plants were only available like maybe 5, and you need 1,500 per acre. So how you get from 5 to 1,500? Well, we did mist propagation, where you grow plants in a greenhouse, and every leaf that grows along a shoot, you cut the shoot off and you put it in a sand bed that's heated and make a plant from that one leaf. And then that one grows. You can do the same thing with that one. Pretty soon it's exponential, and you can create probably from one plant maybe 5,000 plants in one season. So you can multiply rapidly. So we learned to do that. And then I thought I was done with all that. Then phylloxera came along in 1990, and a similar problem. I wanted to have certain clones on certain rootstocks, and they weren't available. So I ended up starting a rootstock nursery, finding out how to graft and doing that process and grafting our own. So now we have our own rootstock nursery and we select our own budwood that we want to put on there, and we're currently now callousing about 37,000 plants. And we'll grow those this year, and they'll be ready to go out in vineyards next spring, a year from now.
What is the most important enological method developed in Oregon?
Well, I think we talked about this, the handling of fruit, the gentle handling of Pinot Noir. I think is a variety that you just can't beat up. I mean, you can't. Some of the early equipment that we had here was low budget equipment, and it did a pretty a good job of tearing the grapes up, and not made the wines that were certainly fairly harsh. And everyone now has gone to, I think, very gentle handling of the fruit. That's I think the major thing on the winemaking side, plus the temperature controls, and in the vineyard, of course, is the management of the vineyard, with all these processes we were talking about, the shoot removal, leaf thinning, and so on.
In 1960, there were no wineries in Oregon. Now there are 252 wineries. What do you think about all these young upstarts coming?
I think it's great. I think it's, it certainly, when we first started, we didn't have critical mass, and now we have an industry now, and you just can't do it with a few wineries. It takes a lot of wineries to have an industry, and I think I think there's 100,000 acres here in the Willamette Valley that could really make great vineyard sites. That might be a little generous, but I don't think it's far off the mark. And when you look at Napa Valley at 25,000 acres and Burgundy at 25,000 acres, and we can do 100,000 acres here in Oregon, in generally pretty much the same kind of climate.
One of the things about Oregon wineries is that there seems to be a camaraderie among the vintners. And if you start planting the other 100,000 acres, do you see that you might lose part of that?
Well, I think as the industry grows, it certainly is not as the tight-knit community it was when we were starting. I think that's part of the evolution. We all stuck together back then because there were enough of us to fit into an old firehouse in Tigard, Oregon, where we would meet, and after our meetings, we would buy a jug of CK Mondavi and have cheese and crackers, and you couldn't do that anymore. So, and I don't even know if I could get started now in terms of what the economic requirements are to get things up and running. It's part of the evolution of that and the growth of the industry. What we did earlier on is we recognized that this was going to. I don't know. We all knew it was going to be as fast as it happened. But with the labeling law regulations that we have, we set up in 1977. I don't think you could pass them today because people wouldn't agree on them. It was hard to agree on them back then, and there was only 13 of us. So.
Speaking of collaborative activities, what do you think of the AVA, the new AVAs? Because for a long time we had only the single Willamette Valley AVA, American Cultural Area. It's basically a legal geographic indicator.
Wines are the appellation of origin is required on the bottle of wine that's made in the United States. So it can say Oregon on it, or it could say Dundee Hills, and Dundee Hills would be an AVA, and it's supposed to be defined geographically and have certain attributes that set it aside from, say, Ribbon Ridge AVA or whatever district that you want to look at. And they're just coming to Oregon now. I think we have 7 of them, 6 of them that are being reviewed now, and they haven't been issued yet, but that we were defining areas where grapes should be different. Whether or not the final wine is going to carry that through, I don't know, for a host of reasons that we've already covered, but it's certainly a beginning. We have the clover cover crop that was put in last fall to control erosion during the winter, and then it also now is giving us nitrogen back when we'll incorporate this back into the soil. And then here we see the vertical trellising, the single permanent wire where the fruiting cane is. And then, each year you remove about 90% of what the vine grew, and you leave only with these two shoots spread out on the wire. And then these other wires are movable catch wires, and as the shoots grow vertical, we want to keep them vertically as they grow, because Pinot Noir will tend to flop around. And with these catch wires, then we move them up as the season progresses. Now, the other thing that you see here is that this was grafted over. We do our own field grafting, and with this white tape is here, and there's a ladybug hanging out underneath there. And this is tar. This was grafted last year. So in 1 year, this was Pinot Gris before, now it's Pinot Noir, just like that. And we now have Pinot Noir where there used to be Pinot Gris, and it's done by field. We call this field grafting. In the greenhouse behind us over here, we're getting ready to do what we call bench grafting. The grafting part of the bench grafting has been done, but we need to grow them in a protected environment when they come out of their callousing chambers, and they're going to go into this solar-powered greenhouse that'll handle about 25,000 plants.
Tell me one more time, the clover.
Clover is a legume, so it fixes nitrogen. It doesn't. It actually gives nitrogen back to the soil where grasses and other cover crops take nitrogen out. And we want to give the vines here a little nitrogen to work with. So, when the clover dies, it gives up that nitrogen and through the nodules in the roots back to the soil, and making available nitrogen for our plants.
And have you been doing this in Oregon for a long time?
Yes, long time. Since the beginning. It's a long time. What's a long? Since the beginning, since we started planting vineyards. This is something other farming operations in Oregon do too, and I saw that when I came here in the 60s. It's not uncommon to see. I think Oregon's been sensitive to what you might call a natural way of farming. I don't want to call it organic. It's just a natural way of farming. It's just to adapt to what the weather is giving you, and what the situation is giving you, the growing situation. You can see the clover's just starting to bloom here. This is crimson clover, and it's just some of the blossoms are just starting to evolve now. The rows that have been disced up over there, we're putting in a crop of what's called buckwheat, and buckwheat isn't a wheat. It's just a plant that grows about this tall, and it hosts predator mites, so that we can control the mites that are getting into our grapes by having the predators come in and have them for dinner. And that way we don't have to spray any insecticides. So we're doing that every fourth row.
Because in Oregon we don't like insecticides.
You don't like insecticides. No. Pesticides, insecticides. We try to manage everything with natural things like stylet oil and sulfur, copper to control our. The biggest problem we have in Oregon is because of the cool weather, is we have mildew diseases, powdery mildew it's called. Same thing the roses get. Matter of fact, roses and grapevines are really closely related in terms of what they have to do each year and what they're susceptible to. And then we have.
Yeah, that's the reason that roses many times are planted.
Yeah, we have one vineyard that in the old days in France they would put a rose at the end of the row of grapevines, because the rose would get the mildew before the grapes did, and we saw then you knew it was time to spray. So we have more fancy ways of predicting that now. But
kind of like the canary in the coal mine.
Yeah. Could you point out, especially this time of year, even though people think we're just getting leaves here, could you point out grape cluster?
Well, you can just start
inflorescences or whatever
you can see,
they're called.
They're called inflorescences. You can see this shoot here has actually 2 clusters on it right. There's one there and one there. They're very tiny right now. And this is what's really different about a grape than, say, a cherry. Cherries they're blooming right now, so they're going to that and then they're going to grow their leaves and everything. The grapevine has to take this bud that was formed last year, and actually last year's crop was, this year's crop was determined last year by the amount of light and heat that struck that bud. And it's sort of like loading your gun with, you have a revolver with 6 chambers. Well, we see 2 clusters there, so we had good light and heat last year to get bud differentiation, which means how much of the bud went to fruit and shoot, leaves and tendrils. You can see, if you were to dissect the bud and look under a microscope, all of this year's shoot can be seen in that bud from last year. But now the thing has to grow. And when it gets to be, the shoot gets to be about this high, which will be in June, it'll start flowering. And the flowers, these will open up and they'll bloom. Now, if there's a lot of rain, then the powder got wet and the revolver didn't fire on all cylinders. So we'll get a crop reduction from that. So we don't take any fruit off until we see how the weather at bloom has affected us. Here again, you can see the tiny little clusters of grapes. This is where we use arc caning. A grapevine tends to want to always grow at the end buds first. You can notice that these are further along than these buds back here, because it has what's called apical dominance. Grapevines in the wild would grow straight up a tree because they're looking for light. So they're a vine, so they're always trying to extend themselves. So by pointing the ends of the canes downward, the buds on the end won't be as strong because they're not pointing upwards. And then what we'll do is from this spur in here or one of these shoots here will become next year's fruiting canes. So this will be all cut off this winter. And we'll take a shoot probably from here and one from over here and do the same thing again. So when you're pruning in the wintertime, you're always pruning for 2 years. This year's crop and next year's canes.